Everybody, this is Matt Bilinsky. This is The Prevailing Narrative. So I'm coming up in just a second, an interview with my good friend and wellness expert, Max Lugavere. He's a New York Times best-selling author with a number of books in the wellness space. He's releasing a new one called Genius Kitchen today, which is over 100 easy and delicious recipes to make your brain sharp, body strong, and taste buds happy. This is a masterclass on all things health and wellness, but also the types of stuff that we like to discuss on The Prevailing Narrative, how the conversation affects the facts, right? That we'd like to think that health and wellness and medicine is just about the science and the data, but no, unfortunately, in our modern era, the way that people communicate on social media starts to impact how people respond and where the what people's habits are, where the public conversation goes really informs behavior. And so we also get into how that's been influenced in the trajectory of that. So coming up in a minute, me and Max Lugavere, hope you guys enjoyed it. Ladies and gentlemen, Tuesday, March 29th, 2022, this is The Prevailing Narrative, and this week I have a very special guest, my good friend Max Lugavere. He is a health and science journalist, a New York Times bestselling author, podcast extraordinaire with his podcast, The Genius Life, and most importantly, a New Balance evangelist. Max, thank you so much for joining us here this week.
Matt Bilinsky.
I know.
What an honor it is to be here.
It is quite a moment in time.
I love to have witnessed your rise to social media stardom. I mean, and you're just at the very cusp, at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But it's been so wonderful and so gratifying to watch because, you know, we've been friends for such a long time, and I've always admired your intellectual prowess.
Why, thank you.
And you've created this amazing platform for yourself. So mazel tov.
I appreciate that. Anyone who, admires my intellectual prowess is a friend of mine. So, we were always already buddies, but you're really endearing yourself right now. And of course, I got to watch your rise. It's an interesting story of your professional evolution as we kind of met when you were kind of in the trenches on news and current events a few years back with Al Gore's, with an experiment in broadcast television and broadcast news in particular with a company called Current TV, which was funded by Al Gore back in the mid-2000s. Maybe tell us a little bit about that, and then we can kind of get into your very unique backstory as to how you started focusing on health and wellness and now have become one of the go-to sources in that realm.
Yeah. So I started college on a pre-med track. I'd always been passionate about fitness science. I became interested in, I feel like you're going to laugh at this, but bodybuilding when I was in high school.
Yeah, it makes sense. No surprise here.
I became really interested in fitness science and nutrition. And that led to me starting college on a pre-med track. But I realized halfway through my college career that I was also creative and a storyteller. And I stumbled into a class that was an introduction to motion pictures at University of Miami, which is where I went to school. And I was kind of seduced by the idea of studying film as a major. And so I ended up studying film and psychology. I double majored. And that led to me getting this incredible job as a journalist working for Current TV, for Al Gore's TV network from 2005 to, I guess, about 2011. And it wasn't a political network. It really sought to empower young storytellers with the sort of megaphone that traditional media allowed.
And so just to interject, because I think you'll find this interesting, you may not know this. I remember being at UCLA Law School and seeing a lecture from, it wasn't Al, but one of the other executives at Current about how the process of creating television and broadcast content was broken and how Current was starting to use then burgeoning technologies, which were, the kind of foundation for the technologies we now use, but in a completely different form and not nearly as useful or as quick and as effective. But and the thesis of Current TV was that the broadcast model was outdated, and this was kind of the new methodology, right? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that thesis was that was supposed to be different and unique about Current.
Yeah. You probably saw the same lecture that I saw at my comm school at University of Miami by the two guys who were sort of on the road recruiting college students.
It was one guy. He had glasses. He was a bit of an intellectual type. And he just said, hey, the way that we create TV is so ridiculous. Yeah. Everybody has the capacity to create it. People didn't have smartphones in their hands yet, but he kind of suggested that we still had the tools, whether it was just personal recording equipment, to go out and create great content, and that nothing should, the gatekeepers of broadcast television and media should not be stopping anyone from doing so.
Yeah, I mean, point and shoot cameras. I remember I had one in college which is when around the time that we're talking about, we're able to create really epic video and have really high sound quality for the price. It was like $250 for one of these cameras, and you'd be able to like shoot almost cinema quality video. And then camcorders had gotten cheap enough, and computing technology had gotten cheap enough and also powerful enough, where your average person could then like edit, seize the reins of really capable editing software at that point. So to me, it sounded like a dream job when I stumbled into that same lecture. At the time, it wasn't even called Current TV. They had yet to name it. It was called Indie TV. And so I jumped on that idea and I created this film as an independent thesis as an undergraduate, as part of my film major, that I then sent to the powers that were at the network. And based on that film, they hired me to basically anchor the network. Almost 24 hours a day, I was on TV, sort of like the Anderson Cooper for the network. And it wasn't like a political platform. It was really just, they gave the people that worked there, who were by and large young, up and coming talent in the world of media, the ability to create programming for this network that reached 100 million homes. And
would you say that current events and human interest stories would be more the label or the meta tag for that network, not necessarily than news and politics?
Correct. Yeah, it was like current events. It was a lot of evergreen content. We would occasionally do the more topical breaking news stuff, but it was largely evergreen culture stuff. Lots of fashion pieces, lots of technology,
lifestyle
content. Yeah, exactly. But what I think is like really interesting about the current TV model is that it launched almost in tandem at the exact same time as YouTube launched, and obviously YouTube, eclipsed current TV by multiple orders of magnitude. But it was an interesting concept at that time, and it's something that really piqued my interest because I was a young, passionate storyteller, and so they basically saw in me the archetype that they were ultimately seeking to empower. And so they gave me a full-time job. They moved me out to Hollywood. They gave me a small salary, and I did that for about 6 years.
Wow, I actually didn't know your tenure over there was quite that long.
Yeah, it was a long time. I mean, never made a lot of money, but learned a ton and got a good amount of notoriety from it. I left the job as being sort of, I wasn't famous by any stretch of the imagination, but I was like quasi-public figure. I had gotten a decent amount of press at that point. I was verified on Twitter, which came with certain perks. And I ended the job getting signed with one of these like major talent agencies, which put me up, made me eligible for a number of interesting post-current jobs, none of which panned out, which I think is for the better, which, in retrospect.
So I think that's an interesting period in digital media, or let's call it alternative media and content, to look back upon, because everyone forgets that still 2005 to 2011 was once again in tandem with the launch of YouTube. So a platform for people to create their own videos and put them out there into the universe and perhaps gather following, notoriety, create an alternative to what to the legacy and the prestige networks. But it was before Instagram and it was before the internet, before high speed internet. So it was still difficult to consume video. And it was kind of looking back on it, you've had this generation of that first wave of, let's call it influencers or digital creators. And what form were they? And they were some bloggers. There were some bloggers who hit escape velocity, became, pseudo famous during that period, and then have turned that into some turned that into new, digital news entities, the people behind BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or some of those publications. What else were you seeing at that time that you see, if not a straight line from, that seems to have been the foundation of things that had some continuity to our current era, where everything is niche, fragmented, and we have a completely democratized information and content environment?
Well, I think the problem with current was that it was unable to cater to that ultimate fragmentation that the mediascape was ultimately going to undergo, and that's what led to current's ultimate demise. The fact that like this idea of millennials watching mass media is sort of like an oxymoron. It just doesn't really happen anymore. I mean, like there's no like ratings for these like big, appointment viewing television events are at all-time lows, right? And millennials are certainly one of the last, or I think have been one of the first demographics to jump ship. But at that time, current was revolutionary because, as I mentioned, YouTube was brand new. We didn't really know where that was going because, as you mentioned, Wi-Fi wasn't something that was like super fast and totally ubiquitous yet.
Yeah, people still forget the experience of consuming content, whether video or even photographs. They've even kind of, for God knows what reason, tripped and fell into some old photos on a friend's account on Facebook this past week. And you look at the photos from 2008 and to 2011 or so. I mean, they look from truly another era.
Yeah.
They look 50 years old, right? And people really do, have memory hold a little bit, just how crude and rudimentary the content experience was, even through the early 2010s.
Yeah, and also nobody saw at that point like that the iPhone was going to become the dominant smartphone among younger people, right? Like we were,
could have been the BlackBerry.
It could have been the BlackBerry. We were still using I loved having my BlackBerry at the time before I experienced the iPhone, but those were not video capable devices, right? So it was really hard to see where everything was going. But that being said, Current was revolutionary in the sense that younger people, citizen journalists, what have you, would submit content to the network, and within a week it would be on TV. Like that was an amazing to be on TV at that point. Like,
yeah,
it still had all the clout that it had for decades prior to like recent times. So that it was an incredible opportunity for anybody looking to like build a name for themselves, have a little bit of like, get a little bit of credibility under their hat as a filmmaker. And so, yeah, I love the role. And it was, again, like amazing exposure for me.
No, absolutely. It seems like Current was ahead, was very prescient about video and content creation, not so much about distribution and consumption, but a lot of interesting lessons to take from that experience. I'm sure both from yourself or for anyone who's kind of observing and studying media and information. So on to your current iteration, which is once again, as a health and science journalist and specialist in the wellness space. And this is also a very, unique and personal journey that you took in how you became interested, gained a proficiency, and became an expert and a notable source in this world.
Yeah. So it was about 2011. I had just come off of that run at Current TV. I felt like my mileage, I had gotten, all of the mileage possible from that job. And the viewership there had plateaued. So they had kind of hit a plateau themselves as a network, and were starting their slow and inevitable decline, and Current TV doesn't exist anymore. So I jumped ship, I think, at the appropriate time, where I had, sucked whatever sort of marrow I could from it, and was on to hopefully greener pastures. I had signed with this like talent agency, and they put me up for a number of really big shows, but none of them really panned out. And the issue is that like I had gotten really used to creating content on my own terms, and creating content ultimately that had sort of a deeper mission of impacting the world in a positive way. And my passions were, as I mentioned, health, fitness, nutrition, technology, how technology is augmenting health. I became really interested in these Kurzweilian ideas of how the singularity and technology, the rise of nanotech, is going to ultimately halt or at least mitigate biological aging. And all those ideas were sort of, I was marinating in like a bunch of those sort of ideas and trying to figure out where I wanted to go next. And meanwhile, this agency was putting me up for these big like music shows, and there was no way that I was going to be able to compete with like the Nick Cannons of the world and all the other like actual celebrities who ended up getting those jobs, right? So ultimately my agency dropped me, and I was in a bit of I was at a point of career despair. And at that exact moment in my personal life, I started spending more and more time, because I had the leisure, the ability to do so, because I was in between gigs, at home in New York City, which is where I'm from, and around my mother. And I come from a very small Jewish family. I'm the oldest in a family of three, and very close to my mom. And it was about 2011, 2012 that she started to complain of brain fog and problems with her memory and her ability to express herself. And in tandem with that, there were changes to her gait, which is how a person walks. Now, I was a lay person at the time, and I had no prior family history of any kind of neurodegenerative disease. I also harbored, I think, a lot of misconceptions that many people harbor about neurodegenerative conditions like dementia, that it's genetic, that it's an old person's disease. That it's, if it's in your family tree, it's something that that you will ultimately have to succumb to at some point. So I started going with my mom to different doctor's appointments around the city. She lived across the street from NYU, so we started there. Not being able to find answers, ultimately we went to Columbia uptown. Couldn't find answers. Oftentimes a doctor would run a battery of esoteric tests, write a few prescriptions down, and send us on our way. One physician actually thought it was depression, so put my mom on sertraline, which is Zoloft, a common SSRI, antidepressant drug. But it wasn't until the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. We booked a trip there, known for taking on very complex medical cases, assembling a team around the patient. In one room, you'll have an endocrinologist, a cardiologist, a PCP. And it was there for the first time that she was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative condition. The neurologist prescribed drugs for both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at the same time. And I did at that point what any millennial with a data plan would do. I consulted Dr. Google. I went to the Wikipedia page for the drugs that my mom was prescribed. And these phrases stood out to me, like no disease modifying effect, terminal. Nobody's ever recovered from Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, progressive, incurable. And it was that point in my life that I, for the first time ever, remember having a panic attack. I felt the walls of the room that I was in, the Holiday Inn hotel, closing in on me. And it marked a point of no return for me, where I became fixated on trying to understand why this happened to my mom, the woman who I cared most about, of any other person on the planet, and at such a young age, no less. Is there anything out there in terms of the medical literature with regard to a diet or lifestyle intervention that might have a disease-modifying effect? And finally, what could be done to prevent this from ever happening to myself? Because I now have a risk factor. I could very easily, I realized at that point, I had the fortitude to know, even though I wasn't a medical doctor, that if you have a family member that develops one of these chronic types of conditions, that you're very much at risk. And so that was about a decade ago. And it took a long time to turn all of this into a career. That certainly wasn't my intent when I first got started.
What were your discoveries from this research? There were some very specific discoveries about the impact, the connection between nutrition and these degenerative diseases, and in particular brain health. And you came to some very specific conclusions here from your research.
Yeah. So the first insight that I gleaned was that dementia often begins in the brain years, if not decades, before the first symptom. So to me, by some estimates, 30 to 40 years. So if you take my mom's age at the time, which was 58, and you subtract 30, which is a conservative estimate, you got my age. And so I realized that this is definitely not an old person's condition. This is something that we all need to be talking about. And especially at that point, with the oldest millennial approaching the age of 40. I mean, now at this point, the oldest millennial is, I believe, 40 or 41 or something like that. I realized that this is very much a millennial topic, and millennials are not talking about this. Like I was just like shocked that nobody amongst my generation was talking about this. I was interested in it only because I was in the sort of throes of coming to terms with the fact that a loved one had this condition. But I realized that I needed to get younger people talking about it. And I also realized, as a storyteller, as a professional storyteller, that facts tell, stories sell. That if I was going to sell this notion of dementia prevention, that it was going to be with the fact that my mother was very relatable, that I was very relatable and a good communicator, and that I had this incredible opportunity to really move the needle on this condition. And there were a few other insights that I gleaned along the way. For one, I mean, this might shock some listeners, but that it takes 17 years on average for what's discovered in research to be enacted in day-to-day clinical care. So 17 years. I'm like, we have loved ones on the line, right? We have our own cognitive health on the line. Like that's unacceptable. And there were a number of other sort of insights that I had gleaned upon. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that these are complex multifactorial conditions like cardiovascular disease, like cancer. They don't develop overnight. They take years, if not decades, to manifest. And over that time, we have a degree of agency. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly have enough so as not to feel like sitting idly on our hands is the only option. There are certain risk factors that are not modifiable. For example, age, not modifiable. Gender, not modifiable. Genes, not modifiable, right? But your diet is modifiable. Whether or not you smoke, that's a modifiable risk factor. Your overall activity levels, your tendency to exercise or not, those are all variables which fall under your control. And there are others. So for me, it was about becoming a walking meta-analysis, understanding front and back all of the sort of modifiable aspects of one's life that we might choose to interact with, and spreading the good word about those variables.
And so, okay, so you understood that there are behavioral and atmospherical and environmental conditions that do lead to this. It's not just all fixed immutable characteristics of your genetics, your background, or your age, right? So in particular, you found out a link between processed and modified foods, and in particular carbohydrates, which do not serve your brain, regardless of the dietary components or impact, do not serve your brain and your brain's function very well.
Yeah. So, I mean, my views have evolved over the past 6 years. And I think today, the way that I would characterize my dietary views most succinctly would be to minimize to the best of one's ability one's consumption of ultra processed foods. And we can define those in a few as best as one can. You're not going to be able to completely eliminate your consumption of those foods because we're in constant proximity to them in the modern food environment, right? It would be to focus on minimally processed animal and plant products. So animal proteins, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, poultry, wild fatty fish, for example, eggs, all wonderful options. And we can unpack why I've made those recommendations. And whole plants, dark leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, low sugar fruits, nuts, seeds, you name it. To me, it's about getting back to a diet that is less processed. Today, 60% of the calories that your average American consumes comes from ultra-processed foods. These are the foods that hang out in the center of the supermarket. All supermarkets are designed in the same way. Few people realize this, but it's the perimeter of the supermarket that holds all of the fresh, perishable foods. Mm-hmm. It's the aisles where the ultra-processed, shelf-stable foods tend to be. And it's those foods which really characterize the standard American diet. And the standard American diet is, make no mistake, it's an obesogenic diet. It's a diet that has caused I think one of the most pressing epidemics, and it's not COVID-19, it's the obesity epidemic, whereby the year 2030, 1 in 2 adults are going to be not just overweight, but obese.
That is scary. That is a disturbing fact. And then it starts to make a lot more sense and become even more disturbing when you start tracing that back specifically to the instructions given to us by public health and the government. And as you look at a lot of people who may be, let's call it above the ages of 32 to 35, I think the kind of keto or Atkins diet or the discovery of the harmful nature of carbohydrates and the potential of a heavy protein or all protein diet and ketogenic diet kind of came around early mid 2000s. So, but if you're above the age of 32 to 35, you remember as a kid, you were getting the health advice and instruction you were getting from public health officials, from someone who, other than, a personal doctor, what you were told that was based on something called the food pyramid. And the food pyramid essentially advocated for the heaviest part of the most significant part of your diet to be bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, 6 to 11 servings a day. So the government for decades was specifically telling us to eat the things that would be most likely to make us fat. And while the food pyramid has now been delegitimized, certainly in your circles. I'm sure that there's a lot of the American population that, this information has not filtered to necessarily yet, but there are people who, for a variety of reasons, just unfortunately gravitate towards really unhealthy habits and food sources to begin with. But I mean, this was the stated advice of the United States government and the public health officials speaking on its behalf for decades. I mean, it's kind of like, you want to talk about like an alien society or God knows what universe we were living in. I mean, that's just mind-boggling and had to really be disturbing after you were making your discoveries as to the impact that type of diet and those inputs were having on people and their brain function.
Well, that's why I think the precautionary principle is so important, because you're right. I mean, that was the dietary advice that was drilled into the hearts and minds of the American people for decades, right? Eat 7 to 11 servings of grains every single day. I mean, I don't eat that quantity of grains in a month.
Yeah.
And it reminds you of the fact that it was legal to use lead in paint right up until the 70s. The fact that thalidomide was used as a viable drug and led to all kinds of birth defects. The fact that BPA, for example, which was originally designated as an estrogen replacement drug, and it's now in any number of plastic products. Most, I think, perniciously in plastic products that we store our food in. So there are mistakes constantly being made, and it's our health that's paying the price.
And so that's interesting in terms of equipment, cooking equipment, and storage equipment. because these get bandied about a lot, particularly when you start talking about the drop in, the median testosterone or the mean testosterone levels of the American male, right?
Yeah.
That there are testosterone inhibiting or harmful to your testosterone levels ingredients or elements or chemicals in all types of plastic or nonstick pans and things of that nature. I mean, to what extent are those, is that a myth? Are these concerns valid, and to what extent?
No, there has been a slow decline of testosterone over the past few decades, and I don't have any exact numbers to share, but I know that this is the case. Anecdotally, I have a lot of friends who have low testosterone for their age when compared to age-matched controls, and it seems to be a silent epidemic for men, and I think that there are probably a few reasons for it. I think it's overindulgence in on these like ultra processed foods. I think the epidemic of added sugar is a big problem. There have been studies that have shown that one high sugar bolus can reduce testosterone acutely for 2 hours.
That's crazy.
And and we consume about 77 grams of added sugar every single day.
And that seems to be one of the, beyond just the kind of categorical, kind of dissuade or disabusing us of the categorical myth about carbohydrates versus meats, fats, and whatnot. Okay, we figure that out, right? But I don't think people quite understand just how much sugar they're consuming. If people understood where sugar is hiding in non-sweets, in non-desserts, and items that they don't naturally think of as sugar infused, I mean, it's crazy. Condiments, ketchup, sauces, salad dressings, everything.
Bread products,
Sugar is literally all over the place, except in just pure, organic lean meats, I guess.
Yeah. And whole fruits and fresh produce. But yeah, the insidious nature of it is what makes it so treacherous, right? That it's everywhere. And again, we've shown that one single high sugar bolus is enough to drop testosterone. And this effect has been shown to persist for 2 hours post ingestion. It can cause an elevation of systolic blood pressure. We know that having a healthy blood pressure is crucial for having a healthy brain. And just one single high sugar bolus can cause a significant elevation of your blood pressure by stimulating your body's fight or flight response. So I think that the sugar is playing a role in the fact that our testosterone levels are collectively out of whack. But I think it's also going back to these xenoestrogen compounds, these plasticizing chemicals, whether it's parabens or phthalates or bisphenols. They present a big problem.
And how can the average consumer out there combat that?
Well, I think the easiest way and the lowest hanging fruit is to minimize your exposure to plastic, and particularly in the kitchen environment. Stop eating food out of that come in plastic containers. If it's dry food, it's fine, right? But if it's hot food, if it's moist, if it's salty, acidic,
is it kind of peeling off some of the plastic and you're consuming it?
Yeah, it essentially does. It's like these ions are able to enter your food and think about sous vide. You're like boiling food in plastic in hot water. Mm-hmm. It's like the perfect way of adding plastic to your body.
Yeah.
They've found actually that there have been very recently discovered microplastics for the first time in human serum. Mm-hmm. So this is it's a huge problem. It's also, in our furniture, dust gets sloughed off. We end up inhaling it or ingesting it. There's a significant amount of BPA used to create heat-sensitive store registers, receipts. So when you touch receipts, and then humans we have a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior, whether or not we like to admit it. It ends up in circulation. So it's a big problem. These are compounds that act like estrogen in the body. They're called endocrine disruptors. And so yeah, big problem.
Another one of the discovery of the Max Lugavere villains, the villains of the American lifestyle and diet, and also with their kind of counterpoint, their contrapoint of one that you're a heavy advocate for, is in terms of oils, and particularly the villainous constructs of seed oils, as contrasted with the innumerable health benefits of olive oil, particularly organic virgin olive oil.
Extra virgin olive oil.
Love that. Let's hear about that.
Yeah. So I think that it's like the cheap and easily digested refined carbohydrates that play a big problem. The added sugar plays a big problem. And then these grain and seed oils, I think, also play a big problem. Now, we don't have all the evidence required to say that these are toxic to the brain, but because they're made of polyunsaturated fats, these are the exact same kinds of fats that your brain is constituted with. And we know that these fats are delicate, damage prone. They're prone to a form of chemical disfigurement called oxidation. And normally, when found in the context of the whole food matrix, they're bound with antioxidants, powerful antioxidants devised by Mother Nature, riding in tandem with these fats so as to protect them, right? But the problem is when we extract these oils, sometimes using harsh chemical solvents like hexane, other times not, they undergo innumerable industrial processes that harm the oil. They're exposed to light, they're exposed to heat. And so these oils oxidize, and they also undergo other forms of chemical damage, like the generation of man-made trans fats. So all of these grain and seed oils undergo, it's sort of like the food industry's equivalent of the witness protection program. It's the same. It's the reason why you can use the same oil to saute food in a restaurant. You can use it to fry nuts in and call them quote unquote roasted nuts. They're the same oils that you can use in children's cereal, in granola bars, in salad dressings, in mayos. They have no taste. They have no flavor profile, right? So to get these oils, to wring them free of any notable characteristics, they undergo a process called deodorization. And that process creates a small but significant amount of trans fats. Now, trans fats in there were most abundantly found in the human food supply up until a couple of decades ago in the form of partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. So margarines. I grew up consuming margarine instead of butter because it was the quote unquote heart healthy alternative to saturated fat dominant butter and other animal fats. I remember having corn oil in a big plastic tub by the stove. But the issue is that these oils, they have these trans fats now without having undergone this partial hydrogenation process. And trans fats, there's no safe level of trans fat consumption. They're poisonous to your cardiovascular system. Their consumption is associated, even among young and healthy people, with worse memory function. They do put you at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. They also further degrade when we cook with them. So this is another problem. You can buy them, you can pluck them, quote unquote, fresh off the store shelves. And this process of oxidation has already been set into motion. But when you cook with them, when you apply heat, and also when you reheat them, which is often the case in restaurant fryers, certain compounds called aldehydes are generated, many of which are directly toxic, mutagenic, cancer-causing, damaging to your mitochondria, which are the energy-producing organelles of your cells. So they're definitely not fats that you want to have, that you want to overindulge on. Studies have shown that adipocyte concentration, so your adipocytes are your fat cells. Your adipose tissue is your white fat, and adipocytes are fat cells. Your fat cells literally store the fats that you consume. So that saying "you are what you eat," it's a truism with scientific backing. And studies have shown that adipocyte concentration of linoleic acid, which is the dominant fatty acid found in these grain and seed oils, has increased more than twofold over the past 50 years alone. And that's due to the fact that the primary fat, the primary oil now consumed in the standard American diet is soybean oil, which is this dirt cheap commodity, crop subsidized by the U.S. government, rich in omega-6 fats. Worse than that, though, it's that these fats are highly delicate, damage prone. They're not protected by the antioxidants that would be found in whole soybeans, right? And at the end of the day, a damaged fat damages you.
And so the bad fats, how about the good fats? Because you seem to be quite an advocate of healthy fats. In particular, I don't want to call you a full-blown carnivore, but or maybe at certain junctures over the past 5-6 years since you've been on this journey, you have been, but you're very much a proponent of a meat-heavy diet. It codes and it maps to the human experience. Evolutionary wise, our ancestors were eating animal fats and animal proteins constantly, and just based on common sense, why would we currently be fearful of such? Maybe you could give us a little bit of background on your philosophy there and what the types of things we should be eating are.
Yeah, so I don't actually, it's funny because like when you said meat heavy, I don't think of myself as eating a meat heavy diet, but I guess to the woke nutritional orthodoxy, I do eat a meat heavy diet.
We'll get to them in just a second. Don't you worry. We're not there yet. We'll get there.
Yeah. But I advocate for, I think, a very balanced diet of like half the plate being constituted with properly raised animal proteins, and then the other half whole plants. But I do think that meat is, I do think that it's essential in an optimized diet. I think that you can optimize a diet that is a meat-free diet, but is it optimal for the human animal? Is it a biologically appropriate diet? I don't think so. The issue with meat is that you get certain minerals, you get certain compounds in meat that are highly bioavailable to us because we're meat, right? Like, make no mistake, we're animals, right? And so nutrients that are found in animal products are plug and play with regard to our own biology. We can look to omega-3 fatty acids, which in their preformed state, icosapentaenoic acid or EPA fat or docosahexaenoic acid or DHA fat. DHA fat is one of the most important structural building blocks for the human brain. It's found in animal products. It's found in fish. It's found to a smaller degree in grass-fed beef. It's found in eggs. Plant-based forms of omega-3s have to undergo complex biochemical transformation before they can be properly utilized in our bodies. And that process differs in terms of efficacy and efficiency from person to person, gender to gender, genetic background to genetic background. So you're leaving a lot to chance if you're relying on plants for your omega-3s, for example. And that's not the only nutrient where this is the case. You can look at vitamin A or retinol. When you eat animal product like liver, for example, or egg yolks, or we'll even say grass-fed butter, you're getting vitamin A in its preformed state, retinol. It's plug and play to your biology. A lot of people consider beta-carotene vitamin A. That's how we refer to it, but it's actually not vitamin A. It's provitamin A. It has to be converted to retinol in your body, which it does for the most part, but the ability to do that is different person to person. And some people, I believe their ability to convert beta-carotene to vitamin A is reduced by about 25%, if not more. So you're leaving a lot to chance. And depending on where you're from, your ancestry, it's clear that many of these nutrients are in their most bioavailable form in animal products. I guess the most classic example is heme iron. So for anybody suffering from iron deficiency anemia affects 1 in 4 people globally. So it's a major problem, and about half of those cases are due to iron deficiency. Red meat is the ultimate iron supplement. And so there's that. There's fish. You can't really have a conversation about dementia prevention and not bring up the value of wild fatty fish.
The properties of fish and the nutritional properties do seem to have a uniquely powerful benefit to brain health and brain function. Am I correct?
You're correct. And I'll explain why. It's actually really, really kind of interesting. So if you were to take animal fat, like a land animal, like a cow, for example, and take its fat and put it in the fridge, what would happen to the fat? It would harden, right? It would become really solid. Whereas if you left it out at room temperature, it would become really soft, right? Fish inhabit really cold water, the equivalent of the Earth's refrigerator, right? Being like down at deep sea levels. And so they need their flesh, right, and their cell membranes to not become rigid at those temperatures. So fish fat, one of the reasons why fish fat is so precious is it's because they're comprised of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're very fluid. They have this incredible characteristic of fluidity. And that is, in fact, the exact reason why our brains are constituted of these fats. Because our brains, we have neurons that are firing off trillions of messages a minute. They have to possess this characteristic known as fluidity, membrane fluidity. It's crucially important for having an optimally functioning brain. And DHA fat, which fatty fish contain in abundance, is one of the most important structural building blocks of the brain. So that's why fish are just we have this like incredible symbiosis with fish and the fats that they contain.
That is a fascinating explanation. It's one of those dynamics that's bubbling just below the surface of everyone's consciousness. They know it to be true, but they don't quite know why. And so that's that. We love bringing those people those in-depth explanations of these phenomenon that they kind of know to be true, but they don't quite understand the blood and guts. And I'm sure that a lot of this informs your most recent work, which is released today, believe it or not, The Genius Kitchen, which is captioned over 100 easy and delicious recipes to make your brain sharp, your body strong, and taste buds happy. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about this book, how it relates to your other previous release texts, which have all reached the New York Times bestsellers list. Would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so Genius Kitchen it's a 2-in-1 book. It's a cookbook. So we've got over 100 amazing recipes using low cost, easy to access ingredients. Nothing too convoluted in the book. They range in terms of their complexity to prepare, but we've got something for everybody in the book. But it's also a wellness guide and kitchen guide. So it breaks apart each food component, and it you use the term blood and guts. It sort of gives you the blood and guts of my recommendations in a way that makes it really easy to understand why I recommend certain foods and why I may recommend abstaining or at least minimizing your exposure to certain foods. But in general, I think why I've been so quote unquote successful in this sort of wellness world is that my approach is very balanced. It's dogma free. Like I'm a big advocate, for example, of grass finished beef, right? Living in LA and having attained, thankfully, a certain level of financial independence, I can easily access and afford grass-finished beef, right? But that doesn't mean that that grain-finished beef, for example, which is the predominant form of beef sold and consumed in the United States, is bad, right? It's still one of the most nutrient-dense foods in the supermarket. And if that's all that you have access to, then I want to get rid of the stigma that sometimes is cast upon that kind of food. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, I'll admit, because I don't like promoting the factory farm system. I think it's cruel to the animals. It's abhorrent in terms of its, what it's doing to local and global ecosystems. But my bias is towards human health, and I think you just can't get around the fact that, for example, even conventionally raised beef is a much better option for dinner than boxed mac and cheese. Even farm raised salmon. I prefer to eat wild salmon. When I'm in restaurants, I'm sure I eat farmed on occasion, but it's still going to be a better option. And the observational data suggests that the benefits still outweigh the risks with regard to eating farm raised fish. So I kind of lay it all out in my book, from dairy to plants to meat to fish to eggs to salt to water. What to sort of prioritize and sort of optimize for, what to attempt to minimize, and then we've got the recipes. And so it's a really sort of practical book. It's where the rubber hits the road in terms of nutrition, right? Delicious meals, and I'm on the cover, so look at that.
There you go.
Yeah.
Most importantly, Max is on the cover. This book would be the practical manifestations of a lot of the knowledge that you're dispensing on in this chat right now, which is incredible. Obviously very informed by God knows how many studies and understandings of the diseases that affect us, the nutrients that we consume, and whatnot. On this podcast, I always harp on kind of how cultural hostilities and dogmas you mentioned start to disrupt the hard science or the hard facts and hard data around a variety of topics. And unfortunately, it turns out that health and wellness and nutrition have not been immune to this poison over the last, this great era where everyone's able to create content and become an information source and build their own career around being a digital source or a digital creator, has unfortunately been impacted by the fact that, like I said, cultural hostilities seem to contaminate so many different conversations. They have in the wellness community as well. You have bumped up against it in particular, I'd say, in two manifestations: one, the vegan community, and two, the body positivity movement.
Yeah.
So what has been going on in terms of, let's call it, the prevailing narratives, both literal and figurative and tongue-in-cheek, in the wellness community, and where's the conversation at, and where are people bumping up against each other?
Yeah, so I mean, you totally nailed it. It's really those two areas. One would be the health at any size movement, which claims that there is no relationship between obesity, for example, and long-term health. There are a lot of straw man fallacies to come out of that sort of sect online. They'll argue against the BMI as an obesity screening tool. It's actually a very valuable obesity screening tool. It's not a good diagnostic tool, but they'll often conflate those two facts. The BMI is basically It's the body mass index. So it basically uses a very simple calculation. It involves your weight and your height. I forget the exact formula, but it basically characterizes you based on your body size. And if you're a bodybuilder, it's not going to be the most reliable for you because it does not distinguish between fat mass and lean mass. It also becomes more inaccurate at certain with height outliers. But by and large, most people are average by definition, right? They're not these like bodybuilders or height outliers. And so when looking at the population level, BMI is actually a fantastic screening tool to look for obesity. No physician is going to diagnose you with obesity based on your BMI. They're going to look at your body composition, maybe your body fat percentage. But that's just one of the areas where they love to, they love to pick on the BMI. Because
BMI might have a certain flaw not accounting for body composition. So they throw the baby out with the bathwater and they say they demonize BMI despite the fact that it's predictive to a pretty sizable extent of whether or not you're obese, and you might just need to account for edge cases.
Yeah. I would say that most people who complain about the BMI probably
have a large one.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Unfortunately. We know that having a healthy body composition is an important aspect of good health. Now, there is a minority of people that are overweight and metabolically healthy, but that should not be expected to persist throughout one's lifespan, right? And of course, there's a proportion of people who are normal weight and metabolically obese. But again, these are outliers. The norm is that if you are overweight and especially very overweight, you are going to have some other component of metabolic syndrome, right? We already know that having an oversized waistline is associated with worse cardiovascular health because your visceral fat secretes inflammatory hormones and messenger signals like cytokines, which can play a role in the etiology of innumerable chronic conditions. So it's not good to store fat on your, an excessive amount of fat on the waist. And this isn't to say that you need to be like shredded or in fitness competition form, but I think we can't, I think it's just it's a fallacy at this point to say that you can be healthy at any size.
And it seems so evident of all these other just ridiculous battles we're having in the public sphere these days of people trying to demonize or intimidate people away from positions that we've known to be true for thousands and thousands of years out of some sense of moral obligation or the moral appeal that anything is okay, or just because in the past we might have promoted or the advertising world and the entertainment world might have promoted unrealistic goals or visions of beauty, and that the people that were most in the public eye were those outliers at the top of the heap in terms of health, fitness, or attractiveness. And the solution apparently to these people is to throw out every basic understanding and notion that we have about physical fitness or health and promote just the opposite as the ideal, just to, I guess, shove it in the face of the traditionalists.
Yeah, but these industries are also complicit in the etiology of conditions like obesity, which is a disease. Like the junk food, the mantra of the junk food industry and the dietetics industry, I'll add, for a long time has been that calories really are all that matter, and calories certainly matter, but the junk food industry really wants people to believe that all foods fit. And that it's really it's not their fault. It's your fault that you're overweight. All you need to do to right the ship, so to speak, is to eat less and move more, right? But it's the food products that they create. They have this. There's this characteristic of that they all sort of have called hyperpalatability. They're also minimally satiating. So it's the confluence of those two features that.
Putting this in layman's terms, they taste really good and don't fill you up.
They taste really good. They don't fill you up. And those are the foods that are at the foundation of the obesity epidemic. And the reason for that is that by the time you filled yourself up on them, you've already overconsumed them. The same can't be said for minimally processed whole foods, the kinds of foods that you would perhaps, create for yourself. And so for most people struggling with overweight, when given that advice to just eat less, move more, they look at the food that they're already eating, right? The obesogenic food that got them into this position to begin with. And they try to moderate their consumption of those foods, but those foods are not designed to be consumed in moderation, and willpower is a finite resource. So you've already lost the battle. If that's really what your approach is. So I wouldn't put all the blame on these people. And I do think that we need to stop. Like, I think fat shaming is a problem. I think that you certainly can and should love yourself at any size, right? But getting yourself to a healthy body composition should be an expression of the love that you have for yourself at the end of the day.
No doubt. I see you here with the kind of boyfriend looking away meme, and you got the aggrieved girlfriend as cancel culture, the boyfriend looking away as you, and the attractive woman walking down the street is science-based nutrition. And I guess what you were just describing is the cancel culture manifestation in the health and wellness community, and it seems to be doing a lot of damage here. And I mean, how prevalent is this dynamic? It seems that the health and wellness world, because it is scientifically grounded, it's in a good position to combat these people trying to insert new ideologies that might be so nonsensical that it just assumes that people will gravitate to them because they sound avant-garde. I don't know how bad is the discourse going in that world.
Well, nutrition is sort of a unique field because people tend to make their diets their identity. And so people feel they strongly guard their dietary pattern, whether they are carnivores or vegans or pescatarians or gluten-free or what have you. I mean, it's like there's a joke, right, somewhere that how can you tell if somebody's vegan or on a gluten-free diet? They let you know within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. Right?
Can't argue. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of like the unique thing about nutrition. And also nutrition is much more difficult to study than drugs, and yet it's much less well-funded. And so there are all these sort of unanswered questions that has left a lot of room for interpretation. It's one of the reasons why the quote unquote diet wars, which is a real thing, are constantly happening and show no sign of abating anytime soon. Right. The discourse about plant versus animal proteins and plant exclusive diets compared to more omnivorous diets. So that's where a lot of this sort of conflict arises. And there are efforts underway to at least minimize, I think, the conflict, what with disclosures and nutritional papers about the researchers' primary diets of choice, because I think that's a disclosure worth making, right? If you're like publishing a research paper and you yourself happen to be a vegan, I think that's something, normally in research, you have to disclose where your financial funding is from, but now there's this sort of call to get nutrition researchers to reveal their diets, right? Because that could certainly taint your assessment of data.
Everybody's got a motive. Everybody's got an angle.
Exactly.
And it's to validate something else going on, either, a personal habit or a preference or something in their career, something monetarily.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say it's the health at any size movement that has been a bit problematic. But it's like diet culture. I feel like in some ways it's a pushback to diet culture, and there is a lot of toxicity in diet culture, but the anti-diet culture has now become just as toxic. And I think that sort of mirrors a lot of what we're seeing elsewhere in society, right? Like at the extremes of any sort of movement, you're gonna find toxic viewpoints and toxic personalities, right? And
that pretty much all societal dynamics, instead of kind of looking at them as natural outgrowths of human nature or the society that we've built and kind of tweaking it around the margins or trying to address some of where it goes too far, we've decided to just flip them all on their head. So
yeah.
Instead of, okay, you can only be healthy or attractive with a size 19 waist and looking like Kate Moss in 1992. No, all of a sudden we will put people with, females with a body mass index through the roof on the cover of Vogue, and this is what is beautiful now. And I'm not so sure that it seems a little performative.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing, like, because I've thought a lot about this. I think that that breaking open the sort of beauty, the stereotypes of what it means to be beauty, because there shouldn't really be one female sort of like ideal for what beauty is, right? And you nailed it. Like it's been for decades like the sort of Kate Moss ideal. Beauty is subjective. I think we have to embrace that. But health is not as subjective, right? Health is something that we can ascertain with like heart.
I guess what I'm saying is that the movement to overturn accepted truths on health grows out of, it is motivated by a desire to overturn accepted preferences on beauty.
Yeah. Fair. But it shouldn't, because you're conflating two things, right?
It's ridiculous.
That shouldn't be conflated. Yeah, absolutely.
Also, we're just coming off in terms of health and public health in particular, as we discussed a little bit earlier with, public health, once again, the arm of the government or, public institutions advising the public on health and nutrition were completely wrong for decades on what we should be eating. Okay. We just went through the most significant public health event of modern times, the last 100 years with the pandemic, and hopefully of the most significant of our lives going forward. And public health during the pandemic really did bump up against the nutrition and wellness community. I can't tell you how I gained a lot of followers amongst the world of fitness professionals, nutritionists, and whatnot, because I was kind of opposing some of the more broad-based, one-size-fits-all approaches and solutions on COVID, because there are a lot of people who said, wait a second, we're taking care of our health. And there really is such a massive gap between the risk for COVID to people who were of poor health, regardless of age, as opposed to people who were even of normal health. But it seems, someone made a very interesting point that one of the reasons that the pandemic was so destructive in the States is because the United States had underlying health issues to begin with, broad-based, and that, and it's like we were soaking a fuse in kerosene, and then COVID came along and, was the match.
Yeah.
And it just blew up so much of it. It just accentuated so many of the underlying health conditions that we were having kind of across society. How did you see that, from the inside of the wellness world? What were you seeing during the pandemic in particular about the successes or failures of public health?
Well, we live in an unwell society today. 9 in 10 adults have at least some component of the metabolic syndrome. 66% of adults are either overweight or obese. Half of adults have either type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs with regard to our health, and COVID came along and just completely pulled the rug out from beneath our feet. We're not a population that was prepared for this degree of pathogenic threat. But you're absolutely right in that the wellness community, I mean, these are people who've made health and wellness their vocation, right? Their life's purpose, in many ways. I myself being one of them. And so that there were these sort of umbrella mandates, doled out oftentimes completely arbitrarily to the public that didn't make the distinction. There was such a lack of targeting with regard to the mandates and the messaging. It made no sense. And it also, it was just anti-science, like somebody like me or, people sort of in the millennial demographic, people who are fit, very low risk. I mean, this is something that we've known since day one of the pandemic, right? There was that study that came out about a year ago showing that, most of the people about 75% of the people in the hospital were what, overweight or obese or something like that. I think
it was closer to 80.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was upsetting, and it was a lot to contend with. And I tried not to go too, hard into that world. I mean, there are a lot of people in the wellness world, colleagues of mine who really kind of went in and started putting out really great content on it, but
very aggressively against the public health measures and restrictions enacted in response to COVID.
Yeah. I mean,
and they were in trying to put the reality and the science up against the public response. I mean, they subjected themselves to public censure and potential, consequence socially and professionally by trying to advocate for more tailored solutions and policies, but that at first glance would seem, because it did not prioritize the interests at the far edge of the health spectrum where we really had to protect people. But because it did not prioritize the interests of that far spectrum as much as some other people felt was the indicator of being an empathetic and selfless person, I mean, they risked demonization.
Yeah.
Some of them got it.
Well, but the issue is that people who are at risk for COVID are not at the far edge of the risk spectrum, right? It's like most people in this country are unwell. So I tried to see the issue from both sides. Because again, most people are unwell. Age is still the number one risk factor. But yeah, I mean, there were just so many missteps, whether it was the the complete ignoring of natural immunity, the fact that for years we were wearing cloth masks, but cloth masks that was acknowledged by the CDC didn't work. So thanks for making me have to suffer through that for 2 years.
And I'm got to be thinking about environmentally, because I wasn't really thinking about this early on in the pandemic. Holy Christ, the amount of waste we created with the amount of masks that were created and used over the past 24 months. I mean, at that scale, there's got to be some environmental manifestation of all this. Like, how do you even process that amount of waste? It's an ocean's full. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, those blue and white medical masks are made using compounds that are known endocrine disruptors. I believe PFAS substances are used to create those masks. They're the substances that make that essentially make the cloth waterproof. So to speak. That's why it's so that they don't absorb.
It felt like it almost a wax glaze to the masks, right? I imagine that's it.
Yeah. And so you're with your breath, you're heating up and moistening those compounds. You're inhaling them. I don't think that we fully understand the health consequences that having gone through 2 years of breathing in that stuff is going to.
A lot of kind of unique circumstances and environmental impacts and inputs that we have not fully been studied that may have at first glance only very incremental or nominal impacts on public health, but probably over the course, much like the mental health impact of shutting most youths and most children off from, once again, we kind of accepted this is how we raise children in America, obviously in a variety of different formats, depending on where you live, if you're in civic, cosmopolitan, suburban, or rural. But generally, okay, we know that children are best raised, or we know what society looks like when we keep kids generally in school in this environment during their youth, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know what society looks like when we take kids out of, a 6-year-old child has lived for a third of their life pretty much, under these conditions. And we will have to see what the impact of that is. You had a very interesting quote here that I think, you probably relates to a lot of what you've discussed so far, but I'd love to hear your take very specifically on this. Fitting an ancient brain into a modern environment may be like fitting a square peg into a round hole. So interesting. I'd love to hear you what you meant by that in terms of how conducive or not conducive modern environments are for our brains that are the results of evolution, that most millions of years of evolution that mostly occurred without the types of environmental factors or technologies that we now focus on.
Yeah, the modern world has mutated, and it's left our brains as victims. In the opening chapter of Genius Foods, I say that the modern world is like the Hunger Games, and your brain is thrust into battle as an unwitting combatant, weaponless and defenseless. And I think our brains are suffering in many ways, whether it's exposure to chronic stress, to being underslept, to environmental toxicants like these endocrine disruptors, which we were talking about, to overindulgence on sweets and unhealthy industrially refined oils. I think in many ways we're suffering as a result of this sort of era of specialization. If you think about it, a hunter-gatherer had to be self-sufficient. You had to know how to fight off a predator, catch food, clean your food, cook your food, build a tent, light a fire. You had to really be self-sufficient as a hunter-gatherer. And then we transitioned about 10,000 years ago to this new paradigm with regard to human life, where suddenly the settler, the specialist rather, was in vogue. You had somebody to plant the wheat, somebody to pick it, somebody to mill it, somebody to bake it, somebody to sell it. And I think that has I think that's been to the detriment of mental health in many ways, but certainly for people with brains that are more prone to for entrepreneurship, people who are entrepreneurs, there tends to be a disproportionate amount of people with ADHD in that cohort. And those are people that might have been the ultimate hunter-gatherers, people that that don't like to just focus on one thing for 9 hours a day, to like this notion of sort of the one size fits all 9 hour a day desk job. It's something that we've somehow come to accept as normal, right? As like par for the course of being a human being today. But I mean, it's really like
It does not sync with our evolution.
it does not sync with our evolution. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we see so many people struggling with issues related to mental health today, whether it's anxiety or depression. I mean, rates of either of these two conditions are off the charts. I mean, depression is on track to become the number one cause of disability around the world. And so I think it's obviously multifactorial, but I think our lifestyles have are definitely like a key suspect in this.
And so there's been a movement, particularly over the past decade, and a lot, they've kind of flooded the zone, right? We see now where people might, other than the true fitness junkies, up until about 12, 15 years ago, they might have had a couple home fitness products, they had a gym membership, they might have tried to eat organic or even tiptoed around veganism. Now there is no shortage of informational products and nutritional supplements and fitness products that are available to people to try to take the next step in combating all these environmental toxins and whatnot, whether it's red light treatment, alternative forms of health and wellness tech, or the variety, God, how 80% of the commercials, I don't know if it's custom to me, but 80% of the commercials you see on YouTube are some sort of health or fitness supplement, right? So people are trying to look back to ancient wisdom and some of the tactics that our ancestors used in kind of interacting with the physical environment to try to regain some of that wellness that we lost. You obviously, we talk about it as the psychedelic bro profile, let's call it. But we gravitate towards some of this stuff, particularly with one hot and cold treatment that a lot of people have been gravitating towards. And then some people starting to play around with some psychedelics in terms of, with the thesis being that there were some things that were kind of labeled as narcotics when narcotic use kind of sprung back up in the middle of the 20th century that might have been unfairly labeled, and that in its most natural form in a controlled environment or used properly might actually be a health benefit. So psilocybin treatment has been one of those. Love to hear your thoughts on kind of the hot and cold therapy and psilocybin as a part of the wellness plan.
Yeah, I love this. So you and I are big fans of hot and cold immersion, contrast therapy, as it's called. I'm a massive fan of sauna use. So sauna use, there's a lot of good research now coming out of the University of Eastern Finland, which I think is notable because, a lot of these sort of healing self-care modalities, we would see here in the United States, we might see a benefit associated with their utility. However, epidemiology with regard to health and nutrition practices is usually confounded by what's called healthy user bias, right? So somebody who has access to a sauna here in the United States might have resources, right? They might be affluent. They might be investing a significant portion of their leisure time on self-care. So healthy user bias is always sort of like an issue with the studying of these modalities. But in Finland is the sauna capital of the world. They have one sauna on average per household. In Finland.
The Finns, who knew?
Who knew? Yeah. So taking a sauna is like taking a shower. So it's much less likely to be associated with this sort of healthy user effect over there. And what they're showing is that regular sauna use, about 3 to 5 times a week, is associated with robust risk reduction for developing dementia, with developing hypertension, with developing stroke and cardiovascular disease. So it seems to be doing all these really impressive things with regard to one's health. And then mechanistically, I think there are many things at play here. So for one, when you sit in a sauna, you're basically applying a hot compress to your entire body. And what that does is boosts nitric oxide all throughout the body, which helps normalize blood pressure, reduce inflammation, increase blood flow. You also are sweating, so you're purging toxins. Various environmental pollutants come out in your sweat that aren't otherwise excreted, whether it's through urine or feces. So you're doing lots of really good things by sitting in a sauna. Cold immersion is good from a different standpoint. It's really good for, I think, bolstering mental acuity, mental health. To me, it's a very significant state change when I get into a cold plunge or cryotherapy, or even take a cold shower. It's been shown to boost levels of norepinephrine, which are a neurotransmitter involved in focus and attention. And also you get this really interesting effect when you do both back to back. You're essentially with the heat, you're causing the blood to go up to the surface of your skin, right? which is why you get red, you get flushed, you start sweating. And then when you go into the cold water, you're causing sort of a reverse effect where the blood leaves your extremities and goes, to protect your vital organs so that you don't freeze to death. And so by doing that back and forth, you're working all of this this micromusculature in your vasculature that doesn't otherwise get worked out. We also know that sitting in a sauna acts as a sort of mild aerobic exercise mimetic. So you'll notice if you put your two fingers on the radial artery on your wrist, you'll see that your pulse can get to about 120, at least it does for me, which is sort of indicative of an aerobic effect that's occurring. So there are all these really good health promotive effects due to regular sauna use, regular cold water immersion. And that's just sort of scratching the surface.
And you feel incredible.
Yeah, you feel incredible. There's a lot of research now looking at the mental health effects of these two modalities. So yeah, it's we're just now, I think, scratching the surface, but there's been a lot of really good sort of robust research that's been done already. It's definitely something that I recommend people try to integrate as best they can.
Awesome. And to that point, psilocybin.
Yeah.
A lot of people looking into this right now.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I was actually, there's been a number of cool studies looking at psilocybin's ability to foster creative thinking, which I think can be useful for people trying to think around various traumas or even out of the box thinking with regard to problem solving just in their professional or even personal life. There's really good research on using psilocybin as a way to fight depression in an enduring way. Just after 1 or 2 doses, this work is being done out of Johns Hopkins and NYU. Really interesting stuff as a way to, or I think actually MDMA is being used to fight alcoholism. They've shown that there's a lot of promise there. And most recently, I stumbled upon a study that found that psilocybin, low dose psilocybin, was effective for treating migraine, which is really useful because most people that suffer from migraines, they have to take drugs, right? They have to take drugs as needed, but these drugs are really can have serious side effects. Whether it's very strong NSAID drugs or triptan drugs. I believe the study involved a single, fairly low dose, almost a microdose of psilocybin, and over the course of a month, dramatically reduced migraine occurrence as well as severity of the migraines. So yeah, I'm a fan. I think it's a really cool world that we're in now. I'm super grateful that they're doing this research. A lot of it's being done, as I mentioned, Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College in London is sort of an epicenter for this work.
Yeah, it's ironic, but maybe fitting that during an era of such generalized low public health and so much widespread disease and infirmary, simultaneously we're attaining new heights in our access to knowledge and ways to live better. And maybe, I've always thought it's kind of cause and effect. It's the environment became so toxic, we had to start paying attention to it. That the reason that you're seeing another fitness studio on every corner and that you're seeing Equinoxes all over the place and a gym membership is now a staple item as opposed to a luxury item, and all these products, it's because we got so out of shape. Is that, you go watch any American film before maybe, the late 90s and look at the phenotypes, look at the body types. It is shocking. It's like another species, but interesting to see us kind of elevate our knowledge profile in response. One last thing, and I'll let you go. You also, and another interesting dynamic in look, kind of analyzing what new in the economy, what new commercially occurs now that people can become kind of their own celebrities or well-known broadcasters within a specific niche based on social media, is that, being someone who's notable on these topics and has a following, brands, the burgeoning, CPG and wellness and fitness tech brands want to speak to you earlier. And so you at this point are somewhat of a venture capitalist in the space and investing in wellness and tech and wellness tech and nutrition and whatnot. How I'd love a macro view of that, of how this new composition of part influencer, part venture capitalist, because it makes all the sense in the world. It's why you see so many more. It's not that, athletes and celebrities and entertainers always had money. Okay. They weren't always investing in early stage companies, but it just makes a lot more sense in this era, which is why you see so many releases of early, announcements of early stage funding rounds these days, whether it's in the wellness space or otherwise, with influencers or celebrities listed on the cap table. And I'd love kind of your view of how this new phenomenon of the influencer investor has percolated.
Yeah, I mean, I love to invest in companies where I think they're doing good for the world and they're good for the food. They're doing good for the food environment. For example, I invested in a company recently called Serenity Kids, which makes the best, healthiest toddler and children formula that I've ever seen. I mean, if you look at if you go to even Whole Foods, right, and you look at the offerings for children's food, it's like you're feeding your kids Jamba Juice, which is just like very fruit juice heavy. Lots of unhealthy oils and the like. So I found this company. They're the only company of its kind making, and obviously my disclosure is that I'm an investor, but other than that, I have no say day to day in the operation of the company. But they take a meat centric approach, high in healthy fats, no fruit sugar. They use all, complex carbohydrates from tubers and stuff like that. If they use beef, it's going to be grass finished beef. If they use salmon, it's going to be wild salmon. It's called Serenity Kids, as I mentioned. And I love, I love investing in products that I personally would eat or would recommend to my loved ones. And of course, I also have the ability at this point, thankfully, to influence the success of these companies, right? Because I can tell my audience about them. So I think it's a really great sort of intersection and yeah, the CPG space, especially these better for you CPG products, I think it's a sector that's exploding. I mean, all you need to do is check out Expo West, right? Natural Products Expo West for a day. And it's just, you'll see all the products, all the excitement. There's been a number of really big exits lately in the space, whether it's like Primal Kitchen or Hue Kitchen, which, makes those really great chocolate bars.
No doubt.
And so there's real money to be made. This is no longer just like some Erewhon niche thing that's like catering to just a few interested parties. This is like it's gone mainstream. And so it's super exciting. And it's exciting obviously from a commercial standpoint, but it's exciting also because people, as you mentioned, are now more invested than ever in their health, in their well-being, and their wellness. There's all these new avenues to explore. Fitness, right? So if you don't like going to a gym, or if you don't like Pilates, well, we've got this new, like platform where you can, hopefully find what works for you. There's like all these different options now. It's like, it's become like a Vegas buffet.
Yeah.
And I think it's great. Is it working? I don't know. People are still sick, but at least at least we're trending in the right direction.
Yeah, well, at least we see what's possible now. We see that there are some solutions out there. They have only filtered to a select number. They've filtered selectively. Hopefully, they can filter more widespread, and particularly now after the pandemic, when I think a lot of people are willing to. They're focused more on their health. They're focused more on using the tools available to them. So we'll have to see how that translates. Hopefully, the pandemic was a wake up call, and now that we're out of the fog of the boots on the ground, the actual situation here, people can look at it with a bit of a clear view. But in terms of commercial products out there that can help your health and fitness and help you lead a healthier and better life, the Genius Kitchen, available, of course, on Amazon. All the obviously you got to hear Max. You can not difficult to identify him as a wealth of knowledge. So if you want access to this knowledge in more consumable form to inform your choices day to day, the Genius Kitchen. Max, anything else about this book or where we can find it?
I'm just super excited. I mean, the recipes are all incredible. I've got like the best of the best in there. Also, it's like it's a kitchen guide. So whether you're a total novice in the kitchen or you're a seasoned pro, I mean, one of the things that I knew going into this book is that dudes don't typically buy cookbooks, right? Like, when was the last time you bought a cookbook, Matt Bilinsky?
I think I bought The Joy of Cooking just for shits and giggles as a decorative item, maybe like 7 years ago. So that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I went into it like I wrote a book that I thought would appeal to all the genders and therefore provide foods that were and photos and sort of a look for the book that was not just like super like frivolous and florid, but something that would appeal to, to anybody really looking to improve their cooking. And cooking, I think, is like, we talked about how we now live in the era of the specialist, right? And I think, as I mentioned, we've suffered as a result. We outsource our culinary knowledge, right? We outsource our financial literacy. We outsource our health literacy. We outsource our nutrition literacy. The fact that we all now have like smartphones and at Trader Joe's and restaurants, everywhere. We've solved the issue of food scarcity, right?
Yeah.
But our ability to fend for ourselves, to cook delicious meals for ourselves has been lost. And cooking, eating together, it's the way that we communicate. It's the way that we bond, the way that we express love. It's super important. So I hope to bring it back with the Genius Kitchen by paying homage to the joy of cooking and the joy of eating together and being able to create delicious, healthy, nourishing meals for ourselves and those that we care about.
Very noble goals, my friend Max. It was a pleasure and a long time coming. Congrats on the new book. It's fantastic. Can't wait to put it to use myself. Thank you so much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. This is The Prevailing Narrative.
I am Matt Bilinsky. Once again, you can listen and subscribe to The Prevailing Narrative on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now. Make sure to follow me on my socials at Matt Bilinsky, MattBilinsky. The Prevailing Narrative is a Cavalry audio production in association with iHeartRadio. Produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Dana Brunetti and Keegan Rosenberger. For Cavalry Audio, I'm Matt Bilinsky.